A lot of you are getting to this time of the year and you're like, where are the deer at? Or you're seeing tons of deer. There's few of you that are actually seeing a lot of deer. Most of you are actually probably seeing fewer deer, and that's a product of food, habitat, how much food you have. It's also a product of hunting pressure, and hunting pressure dictates this severely, but food probably even more than that, because if you have a lot of food on your land or where you hunt, hidden clear cut on public land, those does, if that's part of the routine, they're always going to keep coming back. So I'm going to talk about why you shouldn't shoot does. And I'm not saying you shouldn't shoot does. No, let me repeat that. I'm not saying you shouldn't shoot does. I've had a year where we shot 12 on the one parcel we had. We've had a lot of years where we've shot 5, 8, somewhere around there. Very few years where we've only shot 1 or 2, except for one. Wisconsin had the Ernebuck. And that's where some of the guys, like I had Ernebucks built up. So I had 5 or 6 ahead of time because I shot so many does in certain years. But sometimes guys had to shoot them so they could earn their buck tag. And I can remember a couple button bucks dying in that case. And that wasn't necessarily a good thing either. I think they said over 30% of the harvest when they had Ernebuck was fawn buck. And because people want to earn their buck tag, and that's how they did it with this dumb little antlerless deer walking around, and they shoot it and it's a button buck, and they earned it. We didn't shoot does usually 1 or 2 at a time, only because we had a property, it was a couple hundred acres we hunted, and if we saw 20, 25 does and fawns, that was about right, for the whole property. And that wasn't necessarily the amount per square mile, that was just on that property with the amount of food we had, with the amount of cover. That wasn't a bad number to see. The problem was if we saw 40, 45, we couldn't just shoot 1 or 2. That's not going to make a dent in the population. We had to shoot 10, we had to shoot 8, we had to shoot 5. So we went from, okay, we don't need to shoot any this year, to 3 years later, now we got to shoot 8, and then back and forth. And I think people think they're shooting 1 or 2 at a time, that's going to make a difference, and it doesn't. But do you even need to shoot does? And this is a video about when not to shoot does. And I think some of you probably already shot some does out there, and that might not necessarily be a good thing for does. We're going to go through this in depth of when to shoot does, when not to. And I get a little frustrated with this. Because I hear all the time, this goes back into my UP days where I go to a remote cabin and do a real estate appraisal, probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, somewhere around there. And someone's complaining, we saw 5 or 6 does last year. They're up by Lake Superior shoreline near Grand Marais, north of Munising. This is an area that averages about 5 deer per square mile or less. So they shot 5, or they had 5 or 6 does, 4 does, whatever it was. They shoot 2 with a bow, because you could that time. And next year wonder where all the deer went. Well, they literally shot the amount of deer and their offspring they would have had for an entire section, square mile of land. And it probably had more far-reaching ramifications than even that. Have a tag. It's like saying I have a hammer in a toolbox, I need to use a hammer every day. You don't have to use a tool just because you have it, just because the DNR gives you a tag. Because just because you have a tag, you have to be a little bit smarter. You can't just say, well, I have a tag, I'm going to shoot it. It needs to go further than that. That's where the conservation efforts come in. I remember back in the day, let's take it the opposite, where people, I would speak on behalf of the QDMA around the UP of Michigan, put on, dozens of talks on my own dime to try to educate people. There's an antler referendum that was going around. We'll talk about that in a second. But bottom line is, people thought because there was QDM in an area, QDM's coming in, this is in the 90s, that or late in early 2000s, that you had to shoot does. And up in the UP, you shouldn't shoot does, and then we'll talk about that. But bottom line is, there were a lot of QDM advocates, staunch QDM supporters and members. QDM, so we got to shoot as many does as we can. The only good doe is a dead doe. So they would try to shoot as many as they can, and that was very, very, very ignorant. It was incorrect. It was the opposite. It was just because we have tags, we need to shoot as many does as we can, that's QDM, it's somehow going to help the herd. Folks, that couldn't be further from the truth. You have to be smarter. And there are even people thought, give me the conservation list of the year. I shot a bunch of does. I had people they'd brag about online. They'd show a pile of 4 or 5 does. Not only did it look bad for QDM in general, but it was very, very misleading because it was not accurate. It's the opposite. They should have been scorned. Looked at, you lowered your population when you didn't need to. There's more thought that goes into it than just have tag, shoot deer. A little bit different. Bucks are different. They're more the lowest hole in the bucket. Those are the hardest ones to get on your land. Those are, waiting for an older buck. Older buck in your area might be a 2-year-old buck, a 5-year-old buck. That's you're hunting for. And bucks are harder to shoot. Does, we could shoot a doe. I mean, we could have shot does on opening day gun season. We didn't see a buck to shoot that we wanted to, and so that was for Wisconsin, so we didn't shoot one. We could shoot a doe almost every night here out in Minnesota. That doesn't mean we have a whole bunch. It just means that they're very predictable. They bed here, they eat here every single day. Dylan and I were just looking at my target buck here in Minnesota. His name's Bo. We've been watching him now 3 years, Dylan, pictures, at least 2.
So this is the 3rd year.
Yeah. I still think 2 years ago in 2020, we had the one like the, the perfect 10. I forget what they call them. But that would have been 2020.
Yeah.
So yeah, this would be 3rd hunting season. But anyways, we've had him on several cameras recently during daylight. He skips around. Where the does in those areas, they're going to hold true to those spots. And so we wanted to go shoot a certain doe that we knew had a mark on it. We could go shoot it because it's always going to be in this spot. Does with big mature bucks, they are not the same. A lot harder to shoot. Have tag, shoot deer. Next year, you don't have a lot of deer, don't whine about it. Number 2 here. I know someone, a client of mine, and it was really hard to work with this individual because you get into gun season. The first year they shot 5 does on opening day, and then we're wondering where the deer were the rest of the year. What happened? We had the deer. We worked so hard on the property. Well, they shot 5 does on an 80-acre parcel and then wondered where the deer were the rest of the week. It's kind of a no-brainer, but that was really frustrating to hear that as someone that helped them build this property. I wouldn't actually cut on this property. And you know what they did the next year? They shot 3. And there was some squabbling between brothers and family, so there was more of a dynamic that went into it, but then they wonder where the deer went. Folks, shoot does, have tags, don't need to, don't wonder where the deer went. Didn't make a good decision. Goes both ways. Oh yeah, people in the area where I hunt in a couple different areas that they'll go out and see 30, 40 deer, 50 does and fawns in one sit. And that's way, way, way excessive. I mean, and then they might go out and shoot 1 or 2 does. We need to take some does, so take 1 or 2. No, you need to take 15 when you have 45 and you're watching. Or you need to take 20. That's a problem in reverse. And we'll talk about that with numbers. A bottom line is, it doesn't matter if you're hunting public or private land. Try to be more of a steward of your permits and don't look at it, have tag, shoot deer. What do you want? We want that caveman mentality. Put a little thought into it. If you're hunting in a remote area on public land, you don't have a lot of deer, know that if you shoot a doe, that might mean you don't see a deer next year, or you don't see very many. You don't have very many. Usually on public land, there's not an excessive amount of deer in most locations. That's more the opposite. UP, Michigan, I was going to talk about that. This is where I learned about QDM and balancing herds in the first place. Part of QDM is a population in balance with the habitat. That's one of the 3 biological principles of QDM. Populations maintained within the appropriate balance of the habitat, improved sex ratios, and adequate buck age structure. Adequate being a moving target, depending on where you're at. Sex ratios, we're not looking at 1-to-1, that's trophy management. The bottom line is, in balance with the habitat, what does that mean? If you don't have a lot of deer and the habitat will support it, raise the population. Also means if you have a whole bunch, shoot some. It's a moving target, that number. But even in the UP of Michigan, there are a lot of areas that are devoid of deer because of huge die-offs. I think it was in 95 through 97, lost 350,000 deer in the UP of Michigan. So a lot of deer, went down. But up there, they have harsh winters. And in a harsh winter, and an average winter, 50% of the fawns die. These are the extreme northern regions, but the UP of Michigan is one of the worst. Up along Lake Superior because of snowfall. Munising, Michigan averages 178 inches of snow. In the northeast part of the county, they average 293. Up in the Houghton, Hancock area, they average over 300 inches of snow, 305, 310. So, big differences up there compared to where you're living, and you're thinking you just got 2 feet of snow on the ground and it's 20 degrees down in Kansas. Yeah, that's going to melt soon. But it's not harsh. It might be harsh for the moment, but deer can survive. But up there, you need those older does because on an average winter, 50% of the fawns die. So if you keep the fawns and shoot the mature doe, you might have just took 3 deer out with that one shot. On the flip side, when you have a heavy winter, 90% of the fawns die and 50% of the yearlings die, the 1.5-year-old deer. So that's a difference up there. So you're trying to maintain an average age higher so that you have a more sustainable herd, so that you can ward off the effects of severe winter. When you get into some ag areas where you get in where deer have averaged those 2.2 fawns per doe, or around that number, then you're looking at, you want to take out those oldest ones because you lower the average age of the herd, which makes them less experienced, easier to hunt, more predictable, but at the same time, they can replenish the herd fast. The numbers grow, so you have to put a little thought in. But the UP of Michigan was different. You know, I spent a lot of hours and money on my own dime going around trying to educate people in the UP. There's a big UP whitetail group up there that was feeding people misinformation, and we had a buck referendum antler point restriction that would have been for the whole entire UP. And if it passed, that meant that people couldn't shoot spikes. You know, I had to have it was a 2-point on a side rule, 3-point on a side rule. So it would protect about 74% of the year and a half old bucks in the entire UP. I actually got 63% of support in the vote, and it failed because it needed 67. It needed a supermajority. Part of the reason it failed and set the UP back decades was because this group was saying, well, that's QDM. If we have QDM, they got to shoot does. Even though that we would go to a meeting, the DNR would be right there. No, we are not going to increase. We can't give out doe permits. We don't have enough deer. And that was the thing. So I went from that approach, you know, back in 99, 2000, learning that when you have low numbers, you raise up the population. In fact, 2004, the QDMA gave me their Deer Manager of the Year award. And that was the same year I published an article talking about how I raised the population of deer on the property over a 5-year period because we had too few numbers in their Quality Whitetails magazine, and then they gave me that award. So it proved, obviously, that even though you're raising numbers, that could be QDM too, just the same. But bottom line is, not everywhere, of course, should you even shoot does ever. And that would be some of those cases up there in the UP. How do you go by your numbers? Well, unfortunately, the scientific community will talk about a pivot point of learning what your numbers are in August and September. That works on big game ranches and areas that have thousands of acres under control where the deer never leave the property, either fenced in or it's big enough that contains a deer herd, 365. Then you can put out corn, feed, and even then the mature bucks avoid that. But in areas like that, you're controlling hunting pressure so much that a lot of times they're coming in. But bottom line is they have figures for that. And they can look and say, okay, these are the numbers, it's pre-hunt. That only works on those big giant properties. It doesn't work on your small property, which is everybody. I assume there might be one of you watching that has thousands of acres or a few thousand acres, you know, combined and contiguous, but probably not. And so you need to go by your October, November deer numbers. That's what you have, that's your huntable herd. And that could be, August, September represents a pivot point. If you have a good property, good area you're hunting on public land or private, numbers are going to go up. If you have a bad one, it's going to go down. That's a point of pivot, that August, September. So you don't want to go by those numbers that means nothing. So you want to go, well, how many deer do I have in October, November, and go from there and make a decision. And the best I can tell you is you're going by from year to year. You'll see increases, decreases, and on the increased years, you shoot some does. My stepson Dante wanted to know, are we going to have our December doe hunt like we have in the past? Depends on what numbers we see over the next little bit. We're not seeing a huge number of does and fawns on the property. If we're seeing 8, 10, 12 consistently down the bottom in our food and food plots, then we might take a couple. If we're not, we won't. So it's kind of the answer. We want to just see what's going on in November here especially and see, because November will start to reflect too. We have a special doe hunt in December. That's a great time. It's towards the end of the bulk of the season. So we're not pressuring the deer herd. It's actually at the end of all firearm. It's the last 4 days, right after firearm or muzzleloader. It's pretty cool they have that. But again, we have tags. It doesn't mean we need to use them. That's not very smart. Best time to shoot does. Look at this. Right here. Opening day of gun season in November. Early season, great time. Closer you get to that middle point, no does. That was a problem with that client. They were shooting does at the worst time. That's when they need to be protecting deer, holding deer if they have private land. Public land. You know, if you have a certain little honey hole that you think you might have some nice bucks around, don't shoot a doe on opening day, because you're not going to have those bucks around going and getting that deer out, pulling it out, dragging it out, gutting it, whatever you do. It's not going to lead towards having a lot of deer on your land. On the flip side, the later it gets into the season, this is a good time to hunt. This is a good time. Early, late, bad, bad, bad. You know, right in the middle. That includes a rut. Now, during that time, though, there are exceptions. All right, you have a buck on the ground. Great time if does are standing around, you have tags and you need to lower the population, shoot them. Because you have to go in and get the buck anyways. So we go in after dark if it's cold. But bottom line is, you're not doubling or tripling up on your intrusions onto the land just to retrieve does. So does, again, especially when it gets into December time, if you have a lot of does around, they're very easy to target, public land or private land, because they do the same thing every single day. So I love hunting them early, hunting them late. Those are great times to shoot does. I hope that makes sense. You want more deer on your land? Don't shoot does. It's that simple. But people have tags, they shoot does. I want someone to hunt, especially on private land. I want so-and-so to get their first deer. Well, that's great, but know that every time you pull the trigger, you're lowering the potential population for next year. No different than if you have too many deer, you probably need to shoot a lot more, but that doesn't mean you need to hunt them right in the bulk of the season. Do it when it's early or late, when it's actually easier to hunt them, and you can do it in groups and fun, like that 4-day doe hunt. It's fun because we've had multiple people on the blind with guns to shoot does in the past. So we have multiple tags, multiple people. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. Picking them off at a distance with a rifle at that time of the year. Maybe you guys have late season. But if you want more deer, obviously don't shoot deer. I mean, it seems so simple. I even feel stupid repeating it, but people complain every year and whine that they don't have deer, and they blame the DNR when they're the ones that shot a bunch of deer the year before. It just makes no sense, but that's our mentality. That's what you see all the time. Approximate numbers. This is a hard one because ag land, 200 acres, we could say 25, 30 deer. And someone's saying, well, man, that's 75 deer per square mile. You can't look at it like that because the deer from a given area are going to concentrate around high quality food the later in the season it gets. Food sources are dwindling. People are overpressuring. So if we go out on those food plots that Dylan and I are going to go out and hunt tonight, and we see 5 deer come out or 8 deer, and then we go in 2 weeks where people are more pressuring deer, more food sources are shrinking, more areas of cover and bedding area are dwindling because people are overpressuring, and we go out in 2 weeks and we see 30 deer. That's not indicative of how many deer it is per square mile because we have it on 30 or 40 acres. You can't say 30 times 16 or whatever the number is to say that's how many deer per square mile. It's not like that. You have to be smart. I know one of my clients down in Mississippi, major mistake. They had the property for about 10 years before I was there. They had a biologist come in February. They saw 200 deer. It was feeding on an invasive shrub they had, in vining shrub down there. Was it kudzu? And so they're feeding on that during the heart of the season, the heart of the winter. So February they had 200 deer. Well, this biologist said, hey, you have way too many deer. You need to shoot 50 does and fawns. 50 does, 50 antlerless deer every year for the next 10 years. Well, they did that for 6 years, and then all of a sudden, or 5 years, and they hit their numbers. And all of a sudden, they're not seeing any deer. The recommendation to shoot those does, even though it was a well-known biologist down there in the South, was completely incorrect because it was based on the wrong time of year. Again, going back to October, November, your controllable herd numbers. Just because you have great food or you're hunting a clear cut. I mean, heck, you get a early winter like they are in the UP of Michigan right now, all those deer go to the deer yards. Just because there's 200 deer in a deer yard doesn't mean there's an abundance of deer. No, it means those deer came from up to 20 miles away in some cases, and they're all stacking into one area for protection and green barn and thermal effect. And that's why they're there, because of cover in that case. They have to, they migrate. So really incorrect numbers. So if you see all these deer in December because they're in the yards early that year because of an early winter, they have in areas up there, they've already had 40 to 50 inches of snow in locations. So it's pushing deer out of fall ranges because they can't get to browse and they're moving down to those green barns. They're going to have a tough winter when they go in there early because they don't have a lot of good food. So the older deer survive actually, even those rundown bucks, they can survive anything. Older does. It's those young ones, again, 50% of fawns on an average, 90% on a bad winter, year and a half olds, 50% on a bad winter die. So, think about that when you're estimating your numbers. We look at ag land around here. If you say, okay, this is a section of deer and they're all in this food source and you have good cover, good food, it's not in a wintering area, 30, 40 deer is a normal number. But you have to think, where are these deer coming from? Are these representative of just this 100 acres? Or is it representative of a mile around? Think about that. Where are the other deer? Make choices like that. And then know when you have deer coming onto your land in December and you think you have too many already, which deer are the ones from your land, which deer are the ones from someone else's. So you may be shooting does that are from 2 miles away and have no effect on the property that you're hunting right here. And so just think about it. Ask yourself why. I have a tag. Why am I shooting? I don't have tags. Do I need to have other people come on the property? And certainly if you need to raise the population like I did in the UP of Michigan, here in Minnesota, we're at balance. We have good coyote population. I don't know if that gets a few fawns here and there, but we see a lot more bucks overall, number of bucks, than we do does on the property. And it's because We don't have the giant food sources of 20 acres like some of our neighbors where they're concentrating. They might go out and see 35, 40 does. That happens in Wisconsin too. And fawns, and we're seeing, you know, a quarter of that number or less and a few bucks. And you have that balance. I don't want those properties and food sources where I'm feeding 40 does and fawns. We don't have summer food, so that helps too. We're not raising that summer herd in that doe factory. It's a real thing. We have a lot of property people around here that deal with the negative effects of doe factories and not having those bucks when they want them because there's too many does and fawns, eating them out of house and home. That's a real effect. Bottom line with shooting these doe numbers, you can tell I get a little fired up about this, but you know, there's a lot of people out there that are shooting does that don't need to. And then there's a lot of people that don't have deer the next year, they're complaining. And then there's a lot of you out there that aren't shooting does when you need to, especially when you have those higher numbers and you're taking out 1 or 2 when you need to take out 10 or 15. So think about it. That's when you actually become a steward of the land and a conservationist, when you're actually putting thought to the decisions you're making and basing it on correct information. For example, not on the pivot point of August, September that applies to a giant game farm or fenced in area or thousands of acres, but you're actually putting thought into the numbers. Does this make sense? Why you're pulling the trigger? How is this going to affect the herd, good or bad? Low or high numbers? That's when you become a steward, and that's where you become a conservationist. And that's what I want to see this. I want to see common sense deer management. Not because something written in some manual somewhere says you should do it this way. Use your head. Some common sense goes a long ways to making sure you're making the right decisions. And again, you know, I'll keep mentioning this. Some people have gotten sick of this already, but links in the description. 25% off HuntWise, 40% off First Light through the 28th of November. I'm not sure when this video is going to hit. We're getting close to those times. I hope you guys can take advantage of those savings. I love passing them off to you. A lot of people have thanked me for that on the flip side. And if you made it to the end of the video and you watch this, then appreciate you watching all the way. And those are the people that want to take advantage of those savings anyways. And we're still selling switchgrass on the site. The link is there too. We'll be selling that all the way to springtime. And appreciate you guys watching. You know, a lot of times when I'm talking, I'm thinking, how can I wrap this up at the same time? I think today, we'll just end it. Bye. Thanks for watching. I urge everyone out there to really check out my web classes. They've been wildly successful. We have one that details how you should design your land, another one that details how you should plant and maintain and manage a food plot program. How can you make those decisions that fit your land specifically and not someone else's? Unfortunately, there's so much information in the hunting industry that says you should do this, but it doesn't apply to you. These web classes directly apply to you. And then we have our third web class that came out last year, Rut Web Class, navigating the entire rut. And then we have our fourth one coming out, which is hunting hills and thermals. I urge you to check those out, try the web classes, and they're all about teaching, helping you understand how you can navigate, not only managing your property, food plots, and the rut, but also hunting strategically, hills, thermals, and wherever you pursue whitetails for your dream and your passion.